Reconstruction, Chapter 17, The West. Your book opens up with a vignette about White City, which I find very, very interesting. Now, you don't do this, we don't do this much anymore, folk, but the West, the Wild West. When I was a kid, and even throughout the 50s and 60s, most of your TV shows that came on in prime time were Westerns. Shows like Wagon Train, The Rifleman, Bonanza, 26 Men, Hopalong Cassidy, The Lone Ranger. Have any of you ever seen any of these shows? Again, okay, none of you, fine and dandy. But the Western, I mean, what would come on? There'd be the news at 6, or then at 7 o'clock, there'd come the Western. And the Western always featured the good guy, and he carried maybe one gun or two, and usually wore a white horse, and he always won. Always won, hardly ever got hurt. The Western movement was once a big part of American history. And when I was at UT, our department head had done his dissertation on economic history of the West. The West had a characteristic about it that was wild. And for a while there was a man named Turner. His last name was Turner. And he said that the West was what really made the East what it was, that you couldn't get new laws passed in the East, but you go to the West where there was no law, and start from scratch and make up laws, and eventually these laws found their way east. For instance, the first state to give women the right to vote before the other states was Wyoming, followed by Arizona, western states, and then this eventually spread back east. Like other things, like direct election of senators plus popular vote rather than vote of the legislature, started in the West. Anyway, Western history, story of the West. Now, by West, at this point, we're not talking about what we were talking about during the days of the Civil War, where the West was Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and Illinois and Indiana. By West, this time we mean the Great Plains states and beyond, the area of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and beyond. Rocky Mountains. Now, the first whites to visit the West after Lewis and Clark were some mountain men, the most famous mountain man being Jedediah Smith. These men went over to the West and they explored and came back and wrote stories about what they'd seen in the West. Mountain men, they lived rough lives, but they glamorized the West. John Fremont, whom we talked about last time, Fremont, who ran for president in 1856, he had been west and he found a whole lot of trails and he got the nickname the Pathfinder. Another famous westerner was Kit Carson, who was fast with his gun. He was an Indian fighter and a Mexican fighter. The West initially was inhabited by Indians and then after that by Mexicans. Now, folk, this may seem a little hard to believe, but the Mexicans could not get their people to move in. The Americans could, so that's one reason the Americans wound up with the West and not the Mexicans. Now, the Indians, they were there, and they remained there. The Indians had been told that if you move west, we white people will never bother you, we'll never spread out that far. It was a promise that could not be kept. As they moved west, they came into contact with the Indians who did not want them there. There was a series of fights between white and Indian. That, of course, as was a case of all these fights, it led to the Indian losing, owing simply to the fact that the Indians were hopelessly outnumbered. By this time, the Indians had guns and knew how to use them. The Indians had horses, and they became excellent horsemen. But they didn't have, well, they didn't have two things, organization and numbers. Indian fighters are sometimes called braves. They're sometimes called warriors. They were never called soldiers. A soldier fights as a team. But the Indians, I mean, they had the courage to fight, they had the will to fight, and morally, hear this from white men, they were fighting on high ground. They had two good reasons to fight. Number one, the white man was not keeping his treaties. Now hear that from a white man. And number two, the land had belonged to them first. And the white man was coming in encroaching. So they had reasons to fight, but on the other hand, the fighting was suicide. From the beginning, they had no chance at all to win. Well, I remember when I was a kid, I asked my mother, where are the Indians today? And she told me, oh, most of them have been moved to reservations. And this proved to be the case for, oh, many a generation. The Indians were put on reservations. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, there were moves to get them off the reservation. And this continues to this day, to get them assimilated into mainstream society. But there are some folk who, just because of the ancient tribal habits or ancient customs, have found it very, very, very difficult to assimilate. Now, the buffalo. It is estimated in 1800 there might have been 15 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. The Indians lived off these buffalo. They used the buffalo to make their teepees. They used the buffalo for meat. They used the buffalo stomachs for containers, water containers in particular. It may sound gross, but this actually went on.
Yeah, what are teepees?
What's that?
Teepees.
A teepee is a tent held up by poles and tied together again by leather, usually made from buffalo hides, with an entrance somewhere like in the front. The entrance was a flap that could easily be closed over. That's a teepee. I assumed you knew. That's my bad. I assumed you knew that. Anyway, this is a teepee. They again made a buffalo hide. Now, in came the white man, and the white man would shoot up buffalo just for fun. Well, the Indians often hunt buffalo by finding out where the herds were and then getting on the opposite side of a big cliff from where the herds were, and then stampeding the buffalo over the edge of the cliff. And as the buffalo died at the bottom of the cliff, the Indians would go down the bottom of the cliff and pull up as much buffalo meat as they wanted, as much as they could carry, and as many buffalo hides as they could carry. But the Indians nevertheless did not kill off the buffalo the way the white man did. I mentioned 15 million estimated buffalo in the year 1800. By 1890, 90 years later, it is believed that only 600 known buffalo were left on the Great Plains. At this point, buffalo hunting was outlawed. Today, the buffalo is making a comeback, like a lot of other wildlife, like the coyote and other forms of wildlife. But the buffalo, and some of the buffalo are being caged in and treated like cattle, reared up. In the early 1970s, they tried to sell a buffalo burger instead of a beef burger. Make burgers out of buffalo. The idea never caught on, though, for whatever reason.
Ted Turner.
What's that?
Ted Turner's doing pretty well.
Well, okay, I'll stand corrected then.
Buffalo meat.
He sells buffalo meat. All right, he's doing well. I don't know if Ted Turner raises them on a farm. Do you know that, or if
He does.
he raises them on a farm? Well, that way he's guaranteed to have them.
His personal plane has a buffalo.
Okay, I'll stand corrected. Now, one of these fights that's still going on, the fight for the Black Hills. The Black Hills was a bunch of what they call the Badlands, lands where nothing would grow. But the problem with the Black Hills was gold was found there. The American Indians reminded about, hey, you had promised us that you'd leave us alone here, and the white man said, well, we're going to go in anyway. So they fought a series of wars in which the Indians lost, but there was one fight in which the Indians won. And I'll get into that when we get back. We'll be back in about 10 minutes. Oh, by the way,